Hey, welcome everyone. Nice to see everyone here this evening and to have so many people join us online for this lecture. My name is Eric White. I'm the Scheide Librarian at Princeton University Library. It's my privilege to have taught with our speaker this evening, Paul Needham, in a course designed to survey the making of books in the 15th century, both manuscript and printed books in Europe in the 15th century. We finished the second day-long session of that course today. We have 3 more to go ahead with, and members of the class are here today. I'm here to introduce Dr. Needham. He was the Scheide Librarian for how many years? 22 years, heading up to the year 2020 when he retired, and has for a long time, even before that, been a leading scholar and investigator of early printed books, particularly in the 15th century, making innovative discoveries and methodological patterns for us to follow in the study of typography and of paper, and a wide variety of interests ranging from the provenance of books, the use of books, the later use of books, histories of individual copies. The list goes on. I enjoy working with Paul, investigating so many aspects of book culture. And he's been a wonderful presence in the years since his retirement here at Princeton, coming in fairly weekly to continue investigations. And some of those investigations are the subject of tonight's lecture, which bears the title, The Catholicon Press Revisited, The Evidence of Nailheads. And please help me welcome Dr. Paul Needham.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. Glad to see people sitting in the room, even if you've just come to escape the baking heat of Princeton in late July. In December 1982, when I worked at the Morgan Library, I published an article in PBSA about the Catholicon Press, an anonymous Mainz workshop that practically everyone agrees was the shop of Johann Gutenberg. In the almost 43 years since that article, no incunable printing shop has been argued over to the degree and in the often curious way that the Catholicon Press has. A few hints of the odd byways the Catholicon debates have meandered down will come out in this talk. But my focus is the central question: what was the printing surface that produced in inked mirror image the pages of the Catholicon Press books? The question applies to 3 books. The Catholicon itself, a massive 13th century Latin dictionary and grammar. You see it here. This is the copy at the Bridwell Library at SMU in Dallas. And 2 short tractates by St. Thomas Aquinas and by Matthew of Krakow. The Catholicon, whose text is about 1/3 longer than the Gutenberg Bible, is a folio printed on royal-sized paper. A tall copy measures about 40 centimeters high. The Aquinas and Matthew tracts were printed on half sheets of chancery-sized paper. Decently tall copies measure about 20 centimeters in height, and the Aquinas you see here, some copies have 36 lines to the page and others 34 lines. The Matthew of Krakow, which you see here, has 30 lines per page, and there is a wider spacing between the lines. The Catholicon is dated from Mainz, 1460, and that red arrow is pointing to the line where you see the word Annis Dominicae Incarnationis, Annis M 1000, 4 Cs 400, L 50 X 10, 1460. The short tracts of Aquinas and Matthew have no date or place of printing. The question, what was the printing surface, ought, of course, to have an obvious answer: forms of movable type, just like every other incunable. The reason this became not a ridiculous but a serious question arose from an independent channel of evidence, the paper stocks on which the Catholicon Press books were printed. In 1905, German book historian Gottfried Zedler published a very detailed investigation of the Catholicon. He showed that a small number of copies were printed on vellum and the remainder on 3 discrete sets of paper, distinguished by their watermarks, as you see here. Some watermarked with a bull's head. There are 26 copies in all, some on what we call 𝗷𝗫𝘰𝘬𝘬𝘊𝘦𝘯𝘀𝘬 paper made by the 𝗷𝗫𝘰𝘬𝘬 paper mills in Basel, and some on a combination of tower watermarked and crown watermarked papers. Each of those sets surviving in approximately the same number of copies. With just a few exceptions, the paper stocks do not intermix. One copy will be printed only on bull's head paper, another only on 𝗷𝗫𝘰𝘬𝘬 paper, a third only on a mixture of the tower and crown watermark papers. Zedler further determined that each group of copies was printed on a different press, each with its own layout of pinholes on the press. And finally, he showed that the vellum copies had been printed together with the bull's head copies. They have the same pinhole pattern, and only these copies have a 2-line heading printed in red at the top of the first column. It makes sense to think of these as 3 distinct impressions, and so you see one copy of each. The Bridwell copy on bull's head paper with that 2-line red incipit, summa, etc. at the top of the column. A 𝗷𝗫𝘰𝘬𝘬𝘬 copy from the Municipal Library of Grenoble, where that isn't printed, but it's handwritten, that incipit, summa, etc. And the third, this tower and crown watermark copy, which is in the Jagiellonian Library in Krakow. Nobody was bothered by the different paper stocks until 1969, when the modest but very knowledgeable paper historian, Theo Gherardi, published the first of several articles about the papers. Gherardi came by chance, really, to look at the Catholicon's 4 paper stocks, and he found that their use in other incunables belonged to 3 widely separated time periods, as you see here. The dates underneath which are the final results as refined from Gherardi, first by Eva Zische and Dirk Schnittger in Berlin, and then by me, of what was a little more preliminary in Theo's 1969 publication. And then 10 years later, in the late 1470s, Gherardi made another model study of the chancery paper of the 2 quartos, Aquinas and Matthew of Krakow, and he found a similar disparity of dates. And here too, the little diagram in the middle shows you in these quartos, half sheets of paper, the watermark is divided at the fold, and so there's a little bit missing, which is lost in the sewing of the fold. And here too, pinhole patterns show that there were separate presses for the 36-line Aquinas on the left, and for the 34-line Aquinas in the Matthew on the right. So the problem is obvious. The 3 impressions of the Catholicon are of identical typesetting, therefore they are a single edition. And likewise, the 36 and 34-line copies of Aquinas are of identical setting, so they too are a single edition. Well, obviously a book printed on paper made in 1469 cannot have been printed before 1469. And ditto for paper 1472 or 73. So how do we reconcile this? No other incunables present this problem. With regard to the papers they're printed on, the Catholicon Press books, these 3 books, are a unique class. In 1982, I thought, and still think, that there is an answer. These 3 books were not printed from movable types. Rather, they were printed from type pages, so to speak, consisting of 2-line secondary castings, essentially stereotype slugs, but quite thin, not type high. So, by my explanation, in 1460, the text of the Catholicon, this giant text, was set progressively with movable type and carefully proofed. Then pairs of lines of the typesetting were successively used to create 2-line matrices, say by sand casting. over which were cast in type metal 2-line strips reproducing that text. After being used to create the matrices, the typeset lines could be distributed, the types sent back to the case in the ordinary way of the typographic cycle. The resulting stereo strips were assembled in columns of 33 strips, so that would be 66 lines each. And the 2 columns per page were independent of each other. They shift vis-a-vis each other, never joining up as a single unit, such as the form of type would have, 2 columns all locked together immovably. The Catholicon was then, was then printed page by page on bull's head paper and on vellum, and in Mainz, and in 1460, just as the colophon states. Afterward, the strips were stored away, presumably column by column. In 1469, about a year after Gutenberg died, the strips were reassembled and a second impression was printed on 𝗷𝗫𝘰𝘬𝘣 paper. Then the strips were stored again until in 1472 or 3, they were printed from a third time on a combination of Tower and Crown paper stocks. By this time, the strips were very worn. A fourth impression would not have been feasible. And likewise with the Aquinas tract. It was printed with 36 lines to the page in 1459 or 1460, which is when its paper stocks were made. Then its strips were stored and printed from a second time in 1469, when its paper stocks were made, assembled now with 34 lines per page. That would be 7 strips rather than 18 strips. I quickly found corroborating evidence for the fundamental unity of line pairs. While looking at 2 copies of the Catholicon side by side in New York Public Library, I noticed many cases where in one copy, a line pair, always an odd followed by an even numbered line, was in one position against the lines above and below it, as above, where they're lined up very nicely. And in the other copy, it might be shifted laterally to another position, either to left or right, as you see here, where that line pair jets out into the left-hand margin, but there is no movement whatever within that pair of lines. There are hundreds of such examples in the Catholicon and in the 2 quarto tracts. They are a constant feature of the printing surface. Forms of movable type, solidly blocked on the right and left margins by furniture, side sticks, do not behave in this way. They have, so to speak, very little wiggle room. No counterexamples to this double-line unity have been found, that is, of equivalent shifts, either in the Catholicon or really other books, incunables, of equivalent shifts of single lines or of even plus odd lines. It's always odd plus even. And I found out something else, seemingly small but essential to my theory. What you see here is Gherardi's picture of the paper stock evidence. This picture is incomplete. In 1905, Gottfried Sedler had shown that in both the Aquinas and the Matthew tract, the state of the type was in process of development compared to its state in the later quires of the Catholicon. They both must have been printed before the Catholicon was. Therefore, by my explanation, there had to be a so far unrecognized first impression of the Matthew tract. And of course, I hadn't seen one. It would probably turn out to have been printed on the same paper as the 36-line Aquinas. And so here, the modified slide, I soon found a copy of this hidden impression, courtesy of Port Authority and suburban bus lines, by paying a visit to the Scheide Library. Yes, the Scheide copy of Matthew was printed on the same paper as the 36-line Aquinas. And yes, it had the same pinhole pattern as 36-line Aquinas. And a little later, I found a second copy of this hidden impression in America, Matthew 1 as I call it, at the Library of Congress. This LC copy, by the way, had been sold as a duplicate by the Public Library of Trier in the early 20th century. And originally, it had been bound with a copy of the 36-line Aquinas, so they were twins in a binding. They still owned the 36-line Aquinas. Of course, what they sold was not a duplicate. Now, we can prove that this hidden impression of Matthew on 1450s paper actually was printed before the more common impression on 1469 paper. In copies of Matthew, page 20 verso is undamaged. But in all copies recorded so far of Matthew 2, there is damage to the entire page, apparently caused by a sinuous wire which fell onto the printing surface and got crushed into it by the pressure of the platen, creating a permanent white river down the page. And you have the two blue arrows pointing to that channel. However, and you more or less see this in the close-up to the right, the letter forms themselves do not move apart from each other in the slightest from this accident, as would have happened if the wire had been crushed with such force into a page of individual types. The wire even pushes two sides of single types together, but not a trace of movement otherwise. When I published my article, it did not spark joy in the hearts of all incunabulists and bibliographers. Many were certain the argument, admittedly unexpected, just had to be wrong. In London, the doubters included 𝘰𝘰𝘬𝘣𝘬𝘬𝘊𝘬𝘮, James Moseley, Nicholas Barker, and an experienced practical printer, Walter Partridge. And for years I heard ominously that they had seen single line shifts in the British Library copies of the Catholicon, one of each of the three impressions. But my inquiries about specific examples that I could compare with the three copies in New York City and the Scheide Library, the Scheide copy in Princeton, went unanswered. The whole purpose of publishing is to expose your thoughts and evidence to close scrutiny. That is the mechanism by which knowledge advances. The goal should be not to garner praise, but to contribute to the world of learning, or the Republic of Letters, one might even say. When controversy arises, every word that is not directed to excavating the truth is dross. Finally, in 1986, Walter Partridge published an article in which he listed some examples of multiple line shifts, supposedly contradicting my line pair rule. The same year, I published a reply demonstrating that in each of the cases he cited specifically, he was wrong, and correcting other of his arguments. The London world now reluctantly accepted the reality of two-line printing units, but that did not answer their doubts. In 1989, 𝘰𝘰𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝑚 published an extensive article proposing a complete counter-explanation for the Catholicon Press, maintaining that its books were indeed printed from movable types. Her picture is that all three impressions of the Catholicon were printed in 1469. And you see this here, one copy of each, and the argument is that all three were printed in 1469. So the bull's head, here the argument was there was an old supply of bull's head paper that had been sitting in Mainz unused for some 9 years, and then in 1469 was taken out of storage, which of course is not an impossibility. I mean, if it existed in 1460, it could exist in 1469. And that the paper 1472-73 actually could have existed as early as 1470. Now, this latter argument has fatal errors, but I won't go into them here. It really would require a separate lecture with an awful lot of images of watermarks. So just for the sake of argument for this talk, let's say those 1472-3 paper stocks might have existed in 1470. Let's say it's an open question. By this picture, there was a shop in Mainz with 3 printing presses in it. Each press had a different pinhole setup, and each was under the control of a printer or publisher who had his own paper supply. So type pages, movable type, were passed for printing one after another, first to the Bull's Head Press, then to the Gliziani Press, and finally to the Tower Crown Press, after which the pages were broken up and the individual letters making up the pages were distributed back to the correct boxes in their type case. And by the way, if all these papers existed in 1469, there's no reason that the bull's head paper has to be the first to go to press. The Tower Crown could have gone to press first. So by this explanation, it's just a coincidence that we actually know the order in which they were printed. But there could be such a coincidence. Now, I mentioned earlier that a few Catholicon copies have a mixture of sheets from two impressions. And this is the pattern of those mixed copies that have been identified. There are 4 copies that are 𝗷𝗫𝘰𝘬𝘬𝘊𝘦𝘯𝘵 paper, but have some bull's head sheets in them. And there is one copy, in fact, the Scheide copy, which is mostly Tower and Crown paper, but it has one gathering of 𝗷𝗫𝘰𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘊𝘦 paper. Bull's head and Tower and Crown paper, there are none. Now, by the Hellinger thesis, all these were printed in 1469. And so a mixture of bull's head and Tower and Crown paper would have been just as probable as the other mixtures. Well, here it's real easy to calculate the odds. I mean, you can turn this into a card game with 3 cards. The odds that in 5 random mixtures, which would be 5 draws from 3 cards, none will be bull's head plus Tower Crown, which would be like not card 1 plus card 3, is a little less than 1 in 7. So again, could have happened, but the less probable possibility has been chosen as what did happen. And not every copy has been examined for this sheet by sheet. There are 5 Tower Crown copies in Poland. None has been examined closely yet. My prediction is that a mixture of bull's head and Tower Crown paper will never be found. What about the undeniable 2-line units of printing? How, by the Hellinger thesis, does one account for them, which manifest in such oddities as the misarrangement of 2 consecutive line pairs? If you look at the end of the second line there, you see the letter A that a corrector has written in, and you see POL. Then you go down 2 lines to the beginning, or you go down to the 3rd line, and there you see an A for 𝘰𝘰𝘰𝘬𝑣𝘬. So that's the genitive of the word pollex, thumb. And this whole passage has to do with monastic sign language, whereby manipulations of your fingers, you can express words. And the word being expressed here by putting your index finger against the side of your thumb is for means a 60-year-old person. And then 𝗷𝗶𝗏 goes on to explain that makes sense, because that pushing of the index finger on the thumb is like the oppression that widows suffer. So completely logical. Next one slide shows us a 2-line pair, which is just upside down. I mean, if you see the word, the 3rd line, 𝗧𝗹𝗸𝗏𝑒𝑑𝑒𝑛𝑠, well, try to read the line after. It got stuck in its column upside down. Well, James Moseley suggested that every 2 lines of type had been tied up with thread or wire to consolidate them as a block, and that this helped prevent accidents when the type pages were moved from one press to the other. Over time, he firmed up his idea with added hypotheses. What at first was thread or wire became a little later just wire. Then it became wire pulled tight through holes drilled in the sides of the types. And in its final iteration, it became wire pulled tight through holes drilled in the sides of the types, plus the use of an especially sticky ink. And all this was to explain, under movable type, what the 2-line stereotype explanation absolutely requires: the lack of movement of letters within the line pairs. So these competing explanations, mine of 2-line stereo strips printed in 1460, then 69, then 72, 73, Dr. Hellinger's of movable type printing, artificially tied together in pairs with wire or wire plus sticky ink, but all done in 1469, led to a considerable amount of argument in the next few years. With one exception, I don't want to review these arguments, excuse me. But I do want to emphasize that the evidence that the bull's head and vellum copies of the Catholicon were printed in 1460, not 1469, is quite strong and not to be ignored for two reasons. First, the bull's head paper definitely existed in 1460. Go back, please, Aaron. The type itself, even if we didn't have any of this printing, we know it existed in 1461 when it was used to print a broadside. And 1460 is really the date in the colophon. It says, printed in the 𝗷𝗻𝘰𝘰𝘬𝑣𝘪𝘯𝘥𝘪𝘯𝘨. It's saying that the city's like a tender nurse. And to me, this is a hint, maybe I just like it, that the unnamed speaker was a native of Mainz, was brought up in Mainz, as if nursed by Mainz. Traditionally, we doubt the accuracy of any colophon date because the physical evidence of the book is in conflict with it. Only for the Catholicon do some doubt the colophon's date, although the physical evidence of both types and paper supports it. And second, there is a copy of the Catholicon with an inscription recording its purchase by the provost of a convent in 1465 about Trinity Sunday. This would have been early June in 1465. You see bracketed there the dates, 𝑚_, 4 C's, 400s, 𝘊𝑥𝑣, 65th year. Now, by my explanation, of course, I've never seen this copy. The copy has to be on either bull's head or vellum. And yes, it is indeed a bull's head copy. So again, by the Helling explanation, it could have been any of the three because it has to be, something has to be wrong with the date, but the date could have been written in any copy, therefore in any of the three. So there's a 1 in 3 chance that it's what it turned out to be, but so be it. We go with the coincidence. The inconvenience of this inscription for the advocates of movable type printing in 1469 is highlighted by the almost desperate attempts that have been made to invalidate it. There have been at least 4 separate attacks, all misguided, and we will just keep this slide up. First, it was claimed that the date was written over an erasure and so could not be relied on. But Dr. 𝗕𝘏𝑚𝘬𝑗 looked at the copy in Gotha, Germany, and found that there is no erasure. The inscription was written at a single time by a single hand. So second, it was claimed that the reference to the provost who bought the book, Otto Geis, as tunc temporis, those are the last 2 words of the top line, tunc temporis meant formerly provost. And so again, the inscription must be later and could not be fully relied on. I disproved this. Dozens and dozens of late medieval inscriptions show that tunc temporis means at the present time, not formerly. The claim that tunc temporis means formerly was 100% invention. Third came an argument that the inscription was intentionally misdated because of some quarrel within the convent about 5 years later. The illogic and absence of evidence for this was shown by Professor Alfred Schwirk of Munich. Finally, the argument was made that the flyleaf bearing this inscription must have come from some other book of just the same size and have been inserted later into this binding. This on the grounds that it's not conjugate with another flyleaf in the book. Excuse me. The error of this was shown in a careful study of the binding by Martin Bogart of Wolfenbüttel. Martin proved, in close consultation with binding conservators, that the disarrangement of the flyleaves was owing to 19th century binding repairs. The supposed damning non-conjugate Flyleaf is irrelevant. It's a completely independent piece of paper from the leaf with the inscription. So they never could have been conjugate. They're two different pieces of paper from two different periods. Well, none of this directly affects arguments for or against movable type, but even if the Catholicon was printed from movable type, there is powerful evidence that the bull's head and vellum copies were printed in 1460, just as the colophon says. 20 years ago, I would have said I'd published anything I had to say about the Mainz Catholicon. Fundamentally, I personally do not believe the Catholicon books were printed from movable type, not just because the arguments for it have been sometimes literally improbable and often exaggerated, but also because they are purely reactive. They predict nothing, only try to explain away phenomena that are already known, the most notable case being the reality of two-line pairs in all the Catholicon books. Whereas my explanation is predictive. A series of phenomena not known in 1982 have all turned out to meet the requirements of the explanation. Moreover, this coin of being predictive has its other side. My theory is unambiguously disverifiable. Its absolute, unqualified requirement is that within any pair of odd plus even lines, there can be no visible movement of the letter shapes whatsoever. That is, you will not find in the Catholicon Press books what you will find incessantly in books printed from movable types. Small shifts in position of a letter or letters, the result of slight looseness in the printing forms, like this in the Gutenberg Bible. And we see here two copies of the Gutenberg Bible. The one at the top is in the Gutenberg Museum in Mainz. The one below is here in Princeton in the Scheide Library. Look at that word 𝘧𝗹𝗸𝘏, and look at the E against the R. You see it's a little higher in the Gutenberg Museum copy, and it's sort of back in its proper place in the Scheide copy and most copies. And Eric made an overlay where you can sort of see the slight dislocation of position. My complacency was shaken last winter when I read an article that Mr. Farley Katz had published in the 2024 volume of the Gutenberg Jahrbuch. Mr. Katz argued with many illustrations that he had disproved my claim that within a line pair there was no movement of letter shapes. Specifically, he illustrated from many copies, better go on to the next slide, what he identified as rising quads or spacers between words like these. And so here are the same two words in a bull's head copy, in a 𝘠𝘠𝑠ciani copy, and in the Scheide Library. And you see between the two words, there's what should be a blank space, but here there's some printing ink, which gives the outline of that quad or spacer. So it's not as high as the letters on the two sides of it, but it's high enough that the ink ball caught it, particularly its edges. Non-printing quads are types of varying width that reach only to shoulder height, that is, short of the taller face of the letter forms, which project above the shoulder like a mesa. In principle, therefore, the tops of the quads should not be touched by the ink balls. But if a form, that is a page of movable type, is a little loose, quads can rise up and take some ink. As Mr. Katz showed, there are many such inked quads in the Catholicon, we agree. And so he saw a direct disproof of my two-line stereo theory. This was worth discussion. It was the first new physical data from the Catholicon to appear in decades. I was not convinced that what Mr. Katz documented so well was caused by rising or raised quads, which work themselves up in forms of movable type. It seemed to me that the same effect of partial variant inking of quads could occur with two-line stereo strips, from variations in the depth of push of the ink balls from one inking to another. In In general, type pages in early printed books can and do show a great deal of variation in inking from one copy to another, from one page to another. I think my argument about stereostrips still meets, provisionally, let's say, the requirement of non-movement within line pairs for two related reasons. First, if the quad inking, which we see here, is the result of movable type, it is because the forms loosened, decreasing the friction on the sides of the quads caused by their tight fit in the line. Therefore, if the forms were loose, just a little bit loose, there should be some change in distance, however small, between the two types on either side of the quads. Mr. Katz's argument would be proved if such a change in distance, the necessary result of a looser form, which is the motive of action that he proposes, could be verified by measurement with a stated margin of error, because of course every measurement has a margin of error. Second, if quads can move because of loose forms, so can all the other, much more numerous types bearing letter forms on their faces. All types are equal, we may say. Thus, somewhere in the massive Catholicon, we should be able to find at least a few examples of small shifts in the position of single types, just as we saw a couple of minutes ago in the Gutenberg Bible. Whereas my theory requires that if a character within a two-line strip is out of place, let's go ahead, Eric. If it's out of place, it stays out of place permanently in every copy, because it was already out of place when the strip was cast. And here we see the letter X in the word saxorum, which appears to hover above its line. We see it in the Bull's Head copy, Bridwell. We see it, what I would say is 12, 13 years later in the Tower Crown copy, in the Scheide Library. Eric has made a little overlay showing that in both copies, the X's fall on top of each other. They do not move. If any movement of letters can ever be found in the Catholicon Press books, my theory will be wrong, but it hasn't happened yet. I am not sure whether the proponents of movable type printing have even tried to look for this. If they have, they haven't said so. Mr. Katz's article inspired me to look more closely, just as he had, at the printing of the Catholicon Press books themselves, and the Scheide Library has copies of all three. In late February this year, I noticed an oddity, which you see here, and I sent an email about it to Eric. The blob in 𝑎b, in 𝗏𝗏 Ulster. And this line, that word 𝑎b, clearly has a blob on the letter B, which I didn't understand. It seems to have attached itself to the B, and it never went away. So here are copies from all three impressions, and they are blob, blob, blob. Where did this blob come from? My tentative thought was that it was an object that got into the matrix when this line pair was cast, and therefore it has to be in every copy. It occurred to me that other line pairs might also show signs of miscasting, creating accidents that would not occur in settings of movable type. The idea stayed submerged for about 6 weeks. Then Eric noticed a similar blob, but smaller. You see on the word 𝗍𝗏𝘰𝘬𝘬𝘆, between the I and the U, there's a round, you can even see a little bit of indentation in it. But whereas my blob appeared in all three impressions, Eric's was not in the Bull's Head impression, only Galiziani and Tower Crown. So there went my theory of original casting. So I really was not sure how to interpret these blobs, although they seemed vaguely problematic to the hypothesis of movable type printing. Just couldn't put my finger on it. So I decided to consult with a book detective agency, and I went to the Wilding Agency. This Many of you know Nick or know him by reputation, certainly. You see him here characteristically with his book nerd t-shirt, holding a magnifying glass. You may know that Nick loves book problems and will sometimes even drop what he ought to be doing, like grading student papers, when an interesting problem is dangled before him. Nick and I talked and exchanged a few emails. Could this be casting flaws? Could they come from corrosion? Then on April 15th, 1:15 p.m., an email from Nick landed in my inbox, and I quote from it, "A better idea? Nailheads. Some strips are cast too thin or weakened with corrosion. Repair work consists of stabilizing them by nailing between letters." For me, this was like what Luke wrote about Saul. Saul heard the words of Ananias, and, as it was said, immediately there fell from his eyes as it had been scales. I was an instant convert. Nailheads, of course, hence the roundness of the blobs, for one thing. And shortly after, same afternoon, I wrote to Eric, now that Nick has mentioned it, it's the only thing I can picture. So Eric and I started looking at the Catholicon more closely. And in the first few days after Nick's email, our notes back and forth had subject lines like, Nailhead 3 is officially a thing. And one just said, 3 more. And another one said, 2 more. By the next week, we decided we would scrutinize all 740 plus pages of the Catholicon, dividing the work between us, and would crop out images of every nailhead we found. The total of nailheads we have found in the Catholicon, checking multiple copies from all 3 impressions, and in the 2 quartos, Aquinas and Matthew, now comes to well over 1,000. The black ink images we interpret as nailheads are not random splotches on the pages. We see you see here first, on letters, second line, that word in, capital I-N with a paragraph mark. The round blob is just beautifully placed on the letter I. You wouldn't have thought there's anything there because it just looks like capital I. The second, inside letters, the word 𝘰𝘰𝘰𝘬𝘣𝘰, and you see it was nailed right into the bowl of the O. I mean, here it sort of wiped out most of the O. Because it was too high, the ink didn't get around. And you find it between 2 letters. This is the word orbis terrarum cropped down. And so it's ORBI, and then ST, ligature letter, and below, between dark, is a nailhead. And thanks to a remarkable photographic system in the digital lab of Princeton University Library, we have been able to verify that the blobs, or nailheads, really are 3-dimensional solids because they make impressions into the pages, just as the letter forms do. And here we see 4 more examples in magnification, ordinary camera work. Then the system that was used is the Selene photometric stereo system, by which 4 strobe lights at opposing angles illuminate the surface one at a time over 4 successive camera shots. And software configures these images into a depth map of the surface, which is what you see on the right of this slide. The images we'll look at were taken and processed by 𝗰𝘰𝘰𝘬𝘣𝘪𝘯𝘐, our head of digital services. So here we see the end of a line ending in the word out, A-U-T, from the 36-line impression, the Chatsworth copy, in fact, which Rowell digitized when it was on loan here some years back. And the word out is obviously undamaged. The 34-line impression, there's the same setting, but there's a nailhead, which pretty much obliterates the U and the T. Let's look next. And here's a close-up of AUT, and you call it a blob if you're still uncertain. We'll call it a nailhead. Let's go to another. And here we've superimposed the photographic image with the special Selene image. Let's see the next. And here we see the Selene image, and you can see that thing, call it a blob if you want, but it's something pressing quite hard into the paper. Next slide. Well, this is a very cool slide, but it's a little hard to understand right away. What you see going along there is the surface of the paper going along that straight yellow vertical line, which you see. Let's just go to the next slide. The next slide, that canyon is exactly where the blob in out is. And so you see, it is, we don't have the scale of hundreds of a millimeter, I believe, that this reflects. But it shows, yes, that is really driving into the surface. Let's go to the next slide. Now, obviously, the 36-line impression of Aquinas was printed before the 34-line impression, just exactly as the dates of the paper strongly suggest. And it should be no surprise that the two-line stereo strips I hypothesized in 1982 should turn out to contain nailheads. They are precisely what Walter Partridge in 1986 considered the missing element. If he had seen them, he would have been convinced, as he said. The sight of one of these tack or nailheads anywhere in the book would have proved the case for stereo printing, but I've not been able to find a single trace in the 3 copies he had examined. So we have now found what Mr. Partridge was looking for almost 40 years ago. Of course, Mr. Partridge did see nailheads because he looked closely at multiple copies of the Catholicon, but he didn't perceive them because he assumed they would be placed elsewhere at the corners of the strips. And he can't be blamed. He didn't see them. I didn't see them. No reader of any copy of the Catholicon in the past 565 years has seen them. Not until February 24th, 2025 was one seen, and the person who saw it had no clue what he was looking at. So, over 5.5 centuries plus, hundreds of pairs of eyes, readers all fell on them, but no one perceived them as being anything in particular. Until the photons hitting the rods and cones of our retinas fit into a mental framework within which we interpret them, these or any other images are nothing or anything. Think of this as a Rorschach test. We are presented with images, and what do we think we see? This is a page from a manuscript paper prayer book dated 1458, probably written in or for the use of a convent of nuns in the Tyrol. On this page, we see a black blob at the upper right corner. What is it? Anyone knowing anything about 15th century prints will know instantly that you're looking at a metal cut, and therefore the detail is a nailhead. Metal cuts were engraved and stamped with tools on thin copper plates, and the plates were nailed to wooden blocks. And so it's obvious, nailheads. Let's look at the next slide. Here is a word in the Catholicon. We looked at it already, orbis terrarum. What is this? Eric and I and Nick say it's a nailhead. However, if this page was or had been printed from movable type, it couldn't be a nailhead. There would be zero reason to be driving a nail into a form of movable type. And if a nail were driven between 2 types, which is the exact location of this one, it would, of course, push them apart. It's like a wedge, as does not happen here. So let's go to Rorschach test 3. What is this? This is the copy of the Catholicon at the Jagiellonian Library in Krakow. We see a pointed thing. It's just thing, lying in a blank space in the Catholicon. And Eric actually took this photo just a few weeks ago. Here's what we say. When this page was printed, the thing was lying on the printing surface, got inked by the ink ball, and left an impression in this copy when the platen came down over the paper. What is it? Eric and I think it is a loose nail that has fallen onto the page. Let's go to the next slide. We see the printing of the Catholicon Press books as follows. The printing surface of each page was an assemblage of 2-line thin stereocastings. The strips were attached by adhesive, resin say, to bases, probably thin wood. In the course of printing, under pressure from successive pulls of the press's platen, some of the strips began to come loose from their bases. If and when that happened, the printing would be paused, the page taken out from under the platen, and a nail or tack, for many of them are quite small, would be driven into the strip to hold it down more firmly. Therefore, all subsequent impressions or printings of that page would be inked with the nail head showing up. There is a chronological imperative which has been obeyed by every nail head we have identified. The imperative is exemplified in this portion of a line from near the end of the Catholicon. In the Bull's Head copy, Bridwell Library, there is a spaces between the words quia, that's Q, and a round R, it's an abbreviation, and verorum, blank space. If the book had been printed from movable type, we would say, of course, there's a non-printing quad between those two characters. In the Scheide Tower Crown copy, there is a nail head. In fact, it looks like 2 nails, but I postulate that it's a single larger nail whose head has a small gap. We draw a timeline between the printing of that page in the Bridwell copy and the printing of that page in the Scheide copy as follows. When this page of the Catholicon was first printed, this strip, it's the 29th strip of column B of this page, was at first not problematic, as we see in the Bridwell copy. There is no nail head in at least 4 Bull's Head copies. But then some slippage or other problem developed, the printing was paused, and the strip was secured with a nail, and at least 2 Bull's Head copies show the nail. As we find out, vellum and paper sheets were not completely segregated when this page was at press, for again, 2 vellum copies have the nail, but another one does not. And a few other nail heads first appearing in the Bull's Head vellum impression indicate that same situation. But then, at the 𝘕𝘠𝘠𝘠 press, every copy must have the nail head. And we have confirmed this so far in 8 copies. We haven't found any variation. And likewise at the Tower Crown Press, every copy must have the nail head. We have confirmed this so far in 6 copies. Now, if this black mark were something impermanent, like a piece of dirt, grit, it could in principle get removed at some point in the printing at the Tower Crown Press. It wouldn't be permanently there. It wouldn't be part of the strip itself. And so we have a test. By the 2-line stereostrips hypothesis, no Tower Crown copy will lack this mark. It became a permanent part of the strip 12 years earlier, I would say, at some point in the course of printing the Bull's Head in vellum copies. And we've confirmed it in 6 copies. There are about 25 copies, so there are 19 copies. All that has to be done is just look at them, send the result, send a picture of it. We can test it more or less right away in principle. Now, this chronological imperative answers a second argument that Mr. Katz has very recently published. And this is the slide. It's a little bit complicated. In 1992, I pointed out that a pair of lines of the Aquinas tract exist in two settings, and that's the lines. First, we see 36 line, the word bracketed, 𝗬𝗏𝗏𝗏 and the 𝗵𝗔𝑖𝑛𝑎𝑟𝑢m. That's a reference to a very obscure early Eastern Christian heterodox sect that apparently allowed women to be ordained as priests. It's not entirely clear to me that the sect truly existed. Well, this slide shows the order of settings that I argued for in 1992. In the 36-line impression, paper of the 1450s, the two lines are complete. In the 34-line impression on paper of the late 1460s, you find two states in the surviving copies. Some copies, as we show in the middle, and there are at least 9 of them, have the same setting as 36-line Aquinas, but with a big gap of missing letters at the beginning. And the first letter we see on line 1, 𝘊𝘰𝘰𝘬𝑣𝘰𝑚, has a bite taken out of it. I said, 1992, that this strip had undergone an accident and its beginning snapped off at an irregular angle. Now, 10 years earlier, in 1982, I made a similar argument about a line pair in a copy of the Catholicon at New York Public Library. But I was wrong, and Mr. Katz has correctly corrected me. There, what I thought was a broken off beginning to 2 lines, a much shorter break, was actually due to what is called 𝘃𝑗𝑗𝑏𝑖𝑡. Now, going back to Aquinas, other copies, as in the bottom image, and there are at least 16 of these copies, have a reset line pair, and there is a typo in line 2. If you see in the middle of line 2, the correct words are 𝗏𝗏𝗏 and 𝗊𝘰𝘰𝘬𝑣𝘪𝘯𝘏. They give to women. When it was reset, by my chronology, the M got stuck on to 𝗏𝗏𝗏 and then the space with the U, so the 2 sorts have to be, were misset. Now, Mr. Katz argues that my order is backwards. So to see his argument, we just go up the slide. The lines at the bottom here, with the typo, where he says the first setting. And so the idea is that the second setting corrects the typo. Then, as we see in the middle image, the lines were reset, correcting the typo. Yeah, it's possible. However, by his argument, something lay over these first 2 lines, blocking them from fully printing. That is, by his argument, the types were actually there. It's just that they were blocked by something like an irregularly shaped piece of parchment that just kept them from inking. And then finally, as in the top image, the lines of type were rearranged into the 36 lines per page impression, and this time the lines print cleanly and completely. So in other words, in the case of the Aquinas tract, Mr. Katz argues that the copies on the later paper of 1469 were printed first, and the copies on early paper were printed second. And if you believe the books were printed from movable types in the late 1460s, this is possible. You just say the older paper was in the shop, no particular reason why you couldn't have printed from it first. However, the nailheads contradict this. On the same page of 34-line Aquinas, there's a word on line 20, and here, the Scheide copy, there's a nail in the word pars between the A and the R. And this nail gives us the true order of printing. Let's go to the next slide. So I've put it back into what I feel sure is the correct order of printing. Here is the 36-line impression, paper of the late 1450s, 𝗬𝗏𝗏𝗏 complete, and 18 lines down from it, there is the word pars in that copy, no nailhead. Then we get to the 34-line impression. And in some copies, such as the one at Yale, the text has that damage we looked at, and the word pars is still normal, still no nailhead. Then other copies of that 34-line impression with that same setting but damaged. Here in the Scheide copy, the words to supply it have been written in by hand. You can see its handwriting. There, the word pars has acquired a nailhead. So the strip was secured in the course of printing with this damaged 2 lines. And then, second, last of all, they printed the 34-line impression with a reset 2 lines, such as the Rylands copy, and it has the nailhead, and every single copy with the reset lines has the damaged nail. Now, this is not really a surprise. The 36-line Aquinas is made up of 6 bifolia or half sheets, that is 12 leaves. And the 34-line Aquinas has 6 bifolia plus a single leaf, making 13 leaves. The argument we have just reviewed about these reset lines, as we're looking at here, all occur on the 3rd bifolium of the 36-line Aquinas. And we have already seen with out and out that the 5th bifolium of 36-line Aquinas was printed before 34-line Aquinas. So for 2 of the 6 bifolia, we already have proof that 36-line 1450s paper was printed first. Now, no nailheads appear in 36-line Aquinas, but at least 18 appear in 34-line Aquinas, widely scattered. They're scattered in such a way that we have nailhead evidence that all 6 bifolia of the 36-line impression were printed before the bifolia of the 34-line impression, just as the paper stock evidence has always strongly implied. So we conclude the Catholicon Press books were printed from 2-line stereotype castings, not from movable types. The 1,000+ nailheads that appear in copies of the books provide massive corroboration. In the Catholicon Press books, we see Gutenberg's second typographic invention, how to print not from movable types, but from stereotypes. Thank you. Do I stand here and do you survey the room, or what do you want to? We're just room. I see a room from one of our students this week. Yes, Jennifer. Yeah.
Thank you. My question is about where the nailheads appear. So do you think that it was random places where it was coming loose, or why do they appear where they do?
Yeah, you know, well, in terms of their placement, they were intentional, but where along the respective lines they occurred, my picture is just that the strips became a little loose. Maybe they rose up a little, so in inking you got a kind of a squishy motion, and just ad hoc they identified as the spot to be secured. And I will add something, that is, as time went by, the strips deteriorated and became looser. Because in the bull's head vellum impression, I'm just going to say in 1460, there are about 100 pages out of 740 where printing was paused and a nail was driven in. Sometimes 2 different strips had nails driven in. When you got to 1469, the 𝗔𝗯𝘂𝘁 paper, well, of course, all those strips had nails in them, but there were about 250 other pages that were paused and nails were added to them. So it was getting worse. Things were going downhill. Then when you get to the Tower Crown impression, about 1472 or 73, 450 out of the 740 pages were paused in this way in a nailhead driven in. And so there are 450 pages of the 740 in the Tower Crown where you can say there's a state A in some of those copies that didn't yet have the nail, and a state B where you have the nail. And in a few of those, you can even identify a state A, a state B, when they drove in a nail, and a state C, where that wasn't enough, and some other strip started acting weird, and they put one in. And this is what I meant by the chronological imperative. There are no exceptions. Yeah. Oh, man.
Do you have an idea how the stereotypes were cast? Paper mache or else?
You know, I don't, and I don't know how they were cast. I never really dealt with it. The best thing I've heard recently was in a lecture by Paul Nash at Oxford, who's a terribly experienced, well, terribly isn't the word, wonderfully experienced printer and craftsman, and he tried some experiments, and he reported that the only satisfactory result he got was sand casting, which is what I and others had thought already. But he was sort of the first person to say, I tried this out with modern types and I got a pretty good result from it. He tried other methods and nothing worked. So to me, that's modern evidence. It isn't historical evidence, but it's very interesting. John Bidwell has a question, of all people.
John, and give the question, and Paul, can you kind of repeat it, then answer it?
Oh, yeah, okay, I'm sorry, yeah, John, go ahead.
I've got a question about things going downhill.
Yeah.
So, just make sure that I follow the chronology of this. So, the 36 line Aquinas is maybe before Catholicon?
Yes, I mean, probably printed maybe when the Catholicon was just beginning to be printed, but wasn't completed.
Well, this is the reason for my very subjective question.
Yeah.
Looking at your slides, it looks like the 36 line Aquinas is very sharp type.
Well.
As opposed to 34.
Yep.
And the Catholicon.
Yep.
Which begin to look, as you say, squishy.
Yeah.
I mean, wouldn't that be evidence as well?
Well, you know, I mean, it should be, could be. John Bidwell asked whether, because the image of the 36 line Aquinas showed the type so sharp and clean, isn't that in itself evidence that it was printed early? So that, say, Mr. Katz's argument, 34 line Aquinas, doesn't work well with that, because then you have deteriorated printing of a page leading second to extremely clear, sharp printing. I agree. I've never made the argument because it's a little bit subjective. I think, I mean, one could quantify it if one wanted to, and now with digital photography, this is just the kind of thing that can be quantified. I think it's evident. I think it's clear in all cases that the type, or not the type, the image, letter image on the strips deteriorates from one impression to the next. And in fact, we thought of showing a slide showing that because there are some really dramatic examples, but you know, what we found can be verified. The other is sort of like, well, I see it, yeah, I don't see it, or yeah, maybe just the ink was, the type was a little dirty. You know, you can think of alternative explanations, so you don't have a slam dunk argument. Well, stunned into silence. All right.
Yes, thank you for this talk. I was wondering about the first edition or the first printing of the Catholicon. Was that ever, in your experience and the evidence that you've seen, done with a movable type and then later done in this way? And then I have a second question, if I may.
Okay, I'll try to remember the first.
Okay.
Okay, so your first question is, could the first impression have been printed with movable type and then they went to stereo printing? Let me answer that real quickly because the answer is a very clear no, because all those features of paired lines out of place and specifically of shifting of line pairs are in the bull's head first impression just as much as in any of the others.
Great, thank you. And then the other one was just, has this lean looked at all the pages, and are there some, because I noticed that those blobs, those nail heads look so much like periods in other parts of the sentence. And so I'm wondering, is there some depth that we would be able to measure perhaps to see if maybe some of those nail heads ended up on things that look like they should be there, for example, a period or,
Well,
yeah.
you know, they,
Repeat the question.
the question is whether some of what we call nail heads, because they look, many of them look a lot like periods. Some of the nail heads are not round in shape. Some are more trapezoidal in shape. But could they be, mistaken for periods?
Yeah, or just hidden. With the
Yeah,
period.
but Rowell has only begun Selene imaging, but I would say from what we know so far, the nail heads push deeper into the page than the letter images do, including the periods, which are, of course, letter images. Yeah, I mean, you could spend a year studying that, but I think, you know, we do know the answer. And they tried not to put them in places where they might create difficulty in understanding the passage. They kind of avoided where a period would be because they didn't want it to look like mispunctuation, I'm saying.
Well, there are questions on Zoom chat.
Okay,
And,
couple of minutes.
Yeah, and Mr. Farley-Klatz has joined us.
Oh,
and
okay.
Has made 8 or 9 comments that I think will best be looked at carefully and, you know, responded in print. It's hard to read them all. There's
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So I will choose one that actually has a question mark, isn't a statement, but is a question. I think that's
Sure.
better for this forum. So from Farley-Klatz, why would any printer start with a 36-line book printed on 12 sheets of paper and 9 years later go to 34 lines, which required more paper and press time?
You know, that's the, you know, it's a kind of the question that, I mean, that same form of question comes up, I think, even today in a class, you know, one formally similar to that, why didn't? And I just say, if the evidence is that it happened, it happened. I don't try to read the minds of, you know, the evidence is that it happened. And I mean, I can say that 150 years ago, J.H. Hessel's Dutch bibliographer thought the same thing, that it was logical, but that's not evidence.
I'm looking over the lot of comments, a lot of very positive comments, and then it's difficult to find the questions. So I'm looking very quickly. Aaron Pratt has written in.
Yeah, I know Aaron, of course.
Okay. And I'm reading, you see the 2-line units shift, we see that, the initial observations that start this whole mess. So are we looking at a bunch of blocks with strips glued to them that are only the size of 2 lines?
Yes.
Okay, and if so, do we see any vertical shift whatsoever between the 2-line units within an impression caused by gaps forming or closing between the blocks?
Yes. They're rare, but I've seen them. I have a picture on my computer, you'll be delighted to hear, from the Scheide copy, showing where in the Catholicon, the last 2 lines of a column have slipped downward with relation. So there's like a wedge shape between it and the 2 lines directly above it.
Here's another question online. Have you looked for similar nails or nail heads in other kinds of woodworking, such as picture frames, say, or in archaeological finds from the mid-15th century? You know the size of nail heads from their impressions, and I assume you can estimate the dimensions of the nail shafts used in the loose or broken stereotypes as well.
Well, I guess the answer is no, we haven't done that. And of course it could be done, and anybody can do it and maybe should do it.
Thanks, that's from Karen Reeves.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you should try to repeat the question. I'm sorry I didn't remind you. Yeah.
Oh,
Let's look
yeah.
at another one.
Other nails used.
People on Zoom can see the questions.
Yeah, okay, I'm sorry, yeah. So the question is whether, have we been able to compare this with other nails used in other craft activities of the 15th century? And the answer is no, we were busy looking for 1,000 in the Catholicon books, and our eyes were getting very bleary from doing that, and that's where we've got to.
I have two more, I believe.
Okay.
David McFarland writes, why do you think this is the only instance of this kind of printing?
We have the question, why do we think this is the only instance of this kind of printing? Well, I would just say that thousands of incunables have been looked at over the years. Nobody's ever noticed the division into individual paper stocks of different sets of copies. Doesn't mean it's impossible. Something that nobody has looked at might be an example. So it's not impossible. I think it's unlikely.
Thank you. Terry Bellinger from Rare Book School.
Yeah, who is
writes,
that again?
Where horizontally do those nail heads appear? Any consistency of position to the left or right?
Yeah, I would say, now, of course, that's a question that, Terry Bellinger's question is sort of where along the lines do the nail heads appear? Is there like a towards the left or towards the right overall? Sorry, excuse me. We think, I'm sorry. We think that they're ad hoc to the individual situation and aren't in any one particular place because whatever happened in the deterioration showed up at different places. Again, you could quantify that. You could map the location of all 1,000 and make a graph. And do they cluster? I don't know that they will cluster meaningfully, but it's possible. I would invite anybody who wants to do it. We can give them all the information they need to carry on.
That was my final question, Paul. Are we inviting holding institutions of the Catholicon to participate?
Thank you. Yeah, Eric reminds me. Yes, absolutely. Anybody who, say, is in a library where they're able to look at any of the Catholicon Press books or to take, especially now, you can take photographs in reading rooms. If you want to look, you should look. If you see, as I say, if you see something, say something. We will look at anything you send us, identify, the page and the line, and we will compare it with other copies. We have lots of comparisons. We would always like more. One of our former students, Mark Armstrong, at John Carter Brown Library, just sent us, we haven't been able to incorporate it. He looked at the JCB Tower Crown copy, and he looked at every single nailhead we had seen, and he told us what the JCB copy had there. So that is just the ideal collaborator contributor. But yes, and anything we found, we will give the information to anybody.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
Everyone, we're going to have a reception just outside. Please join us, connect and say hello and discuss. And Roel? Yes.